Attempting to embarrass his black maid at a glamorous event, a millionaire is silenced when she displays her true talent, commanding the attention and respect of the crowd. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel buzzed with New York's elite society. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the marble floors, while waiters in pristine white gloves weaved through crowds carrying silver trays of champagne. The annual Whitman Foundation Gala was in full swing, with guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos worth more than most people's annual salaries. Charles Whitman stood at the entrance, a glass of aged scotch in his manicured hand. At 55, his salt and pepper hair and custom Tom Ford tuxedo projected the image of success he'd carefully cultivated over decades. His entrance caused a ripple effect through the crowd. Conversations paused, heads turned, and people automatically shifted to create a path for him. Charles, darling, a woman in her 60s dripping in diamonds, air-kissed his cheeks. The gala is simply magnificent this year. Charles's practiced smile never reached his steel gray eyes. Margaret, you say that every year. Though I must say, the catering service has been disappointing. He raised his voice deliberately, ensuring nearby servers could hear his criticism. Near the kitchen entrance, Vanessa Martinez stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her black dress from a department store's clearance rack. At 25, she'd worked as a housekeeper in the Whitman mansion for 3 years, and this was her first time attending such an event, though not as a guest. Charles had insisted she help supervise the catering staff, a task well below her usual duties. Vanessa's dark skin and simple dress made her stand out among the sea of predominantly white faces and designer labels. She watched Charles work the room, noting how his charm masked the condescension in his voice. Every few minutes, he'd make a show of finding fault with something. The temperature of the wine, the spacing of the tables, the volume of the background music. I mean, really, Charles's voice carried across the room as he addressed a group of investment bankers. You'd think people would understand the basic concept of proper service. But what can you expect from certain backgrounds? His eyes flickered meaningfully toward Vanessa. The group laughed, that particular kind of laugh that comes from people who are more interested in pleasing than genuine amusement. Several guests glanced at Vanessa, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. Vanessa maintained her composure, her face a careful mask of professionalism. Years of working in wealthy households had taught her the art of becoming invisible while remaining present. Inside, though, her heart raced and her fingers clenched tightly around her clutch. Charles approached the bar near where Vanessa stood, his voice loud enough to ensure she would hear. I had to practically draw diagrams for some of the help to understand the proper way to arrange the place settings. It's like teaching advanced calculus to kindergartners. More laughter from his entourage. Vanessa felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned early that showing reaction only encouraged more cruelty. Mr. Whitman, a young server, approached nervously. The chef would like to know if you'd like to review the timing for the main course service. Charles rolled his eyes dramatically. I suppose I must. Can't expect everything to run smoothly without constant supervision. Can we? He turned to his companions. You see what I mean? No initiative, no understanding of proper standards. But then again, he paused for effect, looking directly at Vanessa. Some people simply aren't bred for this level of sophistication. The group's laughter echoed through the ballroom, but a few guests shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa stood straighter, her chin lifted slightly. She'd endured worse, and she knew this wouldn't be the last time she'd face such treatment. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air, a tension that suggested change was coming. As Charles walked away, still entertaining his audience with thinly veiled insults, Vanessa touched the small piece of paper in her dress pocket. It contained musical notes, her secret weapon for the evening. But whether she would have the courage to use it remained to be seen. Lisa Anderson, another employee of the Whitman household, sidled up to Vanessa near the service entrance. Unlike Vanessa, Lisa worked as Charles's personal assistant and had more flexibility in her role. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy dress, while not designer, carried a professional polish. You're not going to let him get away with this, are you? Lisa whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. I heard what he said. Everyone heard. Vanessa shook her head slightly. What am I supposed to do? Challenge him in front of all these people? I need this job, Lisa. No. Lisa pulled the folded sheet music from Vanessa's pocket. You need to show them what you can really do. I didn't arrange for your name to be added to the evening's performers just to have you chicken out now. Vanessa's eyes widened in alarm. You did what? Lisa, I haven't performed in public since. The memories flooded back unbidden. She was 8 years old, standing on a makeshift stage in her church's community center. Her mother, Elena, sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Vanessa's voice filled the room with gospel songs learned from countless Sunday mornings. You have a gift from God, her mother would say, working extra shifts as a nurse to pay for vocal lessons. Don't let anyone tell you different. But then came the school talent show in 10th grade. Vanessa had prepared for weeks, choosing the perfect song. As she stepped onto the stage, someone in the audience shouted, "Wrong audition. American Idol is that way." Laughter rippled through the crowd. She finished her song, but the hurt stayed with her, a wound that never fully healed. Your mother didn't work 3 jobs for nothing, Lisa pressed, bringing Vanessa back to the present. Elena would want you to sing. She always said, I know what she said. Vanessa cut her off, her voice thick with emotion. But that was before she got sick, before the medical bills, before I had to drop out of music school to work full-time. Lisa grabbed Vanessa's shoulders gently. Listen to me. I've heard you singing in the kitchen when you think no one's around. Your voice, it's something special. These people, she gestured to the crowd, they think they know everything about class and culture. Show them what real talent looks like. As if on cue, Charles's voice boomed across the room, making another snide comment about proper breeding and natural refinement. Several guests laughed sycophantically. Vanessa's hands trembled as she smoothed her dress. The stage at the front of the ballroom seemed miles away, though it was only a short walk. The current performers, a string quartet, were nearing the end of their set. What if I mess up? Vanessa whispered. What if they laugh? Then you'll still have your job, your dignity, and a friend who believes in you. Lisa squeezed her hand. But they won't laugh. Trust me. Charles was now holding court near the stage, gesturing grandly as he shared what was undoubtedly another self-aggrandizing story. He hadn't noticed Vanessa moving closer to the performance area, hadn't seen Lisa speaking with the event coordinator. The string quartet finished their piece, and polite applause filled the room. The coordinator approached the microphone, looking at his updated program. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special treat tonight. Please welcome to the stage, Miss Vanessa Martinez. Charles's head snapped up, his expression a mix of confusion and amusement. He clearly thought this was some sort of mistake, a glitch in the evening's carefully planned entertainment. Vanessa took a deep breath and stepped forward. The walk to the stage felt endless, each step carrying the weight of years of doubt, fear, and suppressed dreams. But with each step, she also felt stronger, more determined. As she reached the microphone, she caught sight of her reflection in the ballroom's gilded mirrors. She saw her mother's strength in her own face, heard her voice whispering, "Show them who you are, mi amor." The pianist looked at her expectantly, waiting for her cue. Charles leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, clearly anticipating entertainment of a different kind. Vanessa opened her mouth to sing, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. The first note left Vanessa's lips, pure and clear, filling the vast ballroom with unexpected power. She had chosen, "I Will Always Love You." Not the obvious Whitney Houston version, but a stripped-down arrangement that showcased the raw emotion in her voice. The pianist's fingers moved delicately across the keys, providing subtle accompaniment. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the servers stood still, trays suspended in midair. The transformation of the room was physical, like watching colors seep into a black and white photograph. Charles's smirk froze on his face. He shifted in his chair, his fingers tightening around his scotch glass. The look of amused anticipation morphed into something else, confusion, then disbelief. As Vanessa reached the first chorus, another memory surfaced. She was 16, practicing scales in her tiny bedroom while her mother worked the night shift. The apartment was cold because they couldn't afford heat, but Vanessa kept singing, her breath visible in the winter air. She'd been preparing for her music school audition, determined to make something of herself. The scholarship had come through, full ride to a prestigious conservatory. Her mother had cried when they opened the letter, holding Vanessa tight and whispering prayers of thanksgiving. But 2 months later, the diagnosis came. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Back in the present, Vanessa's voice soared into the bridge of the song. A woman in the front row wiped tears from her eyes, careful not to smudge her expensive makeup. An older gentleman removed his glasses, polishing them unnecessarily with his pocket square. Lisa stood at the back of the room, her hands clasped together, watching as her friend commanded the attention of some of New York's most powerful people. She caught glimpses of whispered conversations. Who was she? Did you know Whitman had such talent working for him? Extraordinary. Charles remained rigid in his seat, his earlier bravado evaporating with each perfect note. He watched as his guests, people who had laughed at his jokes just minutes ago, were moved to tears by his housekeeper's voice. His jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically. The song built toward its climactic moment. Vanessa closed her eyes, channeling every moment of hurt, every sideways glance, every condescending remark she'd endured. Her voice carried years of suppressed emotion, not just her own, but her mother's struggles, the sacrifices they'd both made. A memory flashed. Her last performance before dropping out of music school. Her mother had been in the audience, wearing a headscarf to cover the effects of chemotherapy, but beaming with pride. "No matter what happens," she'd said afterward, "never let them dim your light." The final verse approached. Vanessa opened her eyes, looking directly at Charles for the first time since starting her song. His face had lost its usual confidence, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. He recognized what was happening. His carefully constructed social hierarchy was crumbling in the face of raw talent. Around the room, more people were standing now, drawn in by the authenticity of her performance. These were people who attended the opera at the Met, who had private boxes at Carnegie Hall, who considered themselves connoisseurs of fine music. And here they were, spellbound by a housekeeper. The final note approached, the moment that would define the entire performance. Vanessa gathered her strength, thinking of her mother, of Lisa's faith in her, of all the time she'd been told to stay in her place. The note emerged, crystal clear and powerful, holding steady as it filled every corner of the ballroom. Time seemed to stop. The note hung in the air like a challenge, like a declaration. In that moment, the barriers between employer and employee, between high society and working class, became meaningless. There was only the music and the undeniable truth it revealed. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa stood at the microphone, her heart pounding, waiting for the response that would determine what happened next. Charles Whitman's face had turned an interesting shade of red, but he wasn't the one she was watching anymore. The real show was about to begin. The silence lasted precisely 3 seconds before the ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Vanessa stood her ground at the microphone, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. Rather than stepping back or lowering her gaze as she had done countless times before, she remained centered, focused. Charles Whitman's attempt to appear unfazed failed spectacularly. His usual mask of superiority cracked as he watched his guests rise to their feet one by one. He reached for his scotch glass, finding it empty, and signaled urgently for a refill. Vanessa stepped forward, still commanding the stage. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same strength as her singing, amplified by the microphone and her newfound confidence. "Mr. Whitman," she began, causing him to freeze mid-sip. "You once told me that some people aren't bred for sophistication." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. But sophistication isn't bred. It's not bought. It can't be inherited like your fortune or acquired like your art collection. A few gasps emerged from the audience. No one had ever heard the staff speak to Charles this way. In the back, Lisa pressed her hands to her mouth, equal parts terrified and proud. True sophistication, Vanessa continued, her voice steady, is recognizing talent and humanity regardless of its package. It's understanding that greatness doesn't come with a pedigree. Charles started to stand, his face flushed, but a gentle hand from his wife Patricia kept him seated. Around him, guests were nodding, some openly agreeing with Vanessa's words. For 3 years, I've cleaned your home, served your guests, and endured your comments. Not because I couldn't do better, but because circumstances forced me to put my dreams on hold. My mother taught me that dignity isn't about what you do, but how you do it. The memory of her mother gave her voice extra strength. She worked as a nurse for 30 years, saving lives regardless of whether her patients were billionaires or homeless. She paid for my music lessons with extra shifts, believing that talent deserves a chance to grow, no matter where it comes from. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Several of his closest associates had moved away slightly, creating a visible distance between themselves and him. Tonight, when you mocked the help and their lack of refinement, you weren't just insulting me. You were insulting every person who's ever had to set aside their dreams to survive. Every parent who's worked extra hours to give their child a chance. Every individual who's been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. The room was absolutely still. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing in solidarity with their colleague. A prominent opera singer in the audience was nodding vigorously, tears streaming down her face. But here's what you failed to understand, Mr. Whitman. Vanessa's voice took on a gentler tone, though no less powerful. Those struggles don't make us less sophisticated. They make us more resilient, more compassionate, more human. Charles attempted to maintain his composure, but his hand trembled as he set down his glass. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and everyone in the room felt it. I don't expect an apology, Vanessa concluded. I don't even expect you to change. But I want you and everyone in this room to remember this moment. Remember that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their job, their background, or their circumstances. She paused, looking around the room, making eye contact with various guests. Talent, dignity, and worth aren't exclusive to any social class. They're found everywhere, in penthouses and in service quarters, in opera houses and in church choirs, in mansion owners and in their housekeepers. The silence that followed was different from before. It wasn't the quiet of shock or anticipation, but rather the silence of collective reflection. Charles Whitman, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, found himself without words. The next few moments would determine how this confrontation would end, but one thing was already clear. Nothing at the Whitman household would ever be the same again. Without warning, Vanessa launched into another song, Amazing Grace. The choice was deliberate, stripped of accompaniment, letting her voice carry the weight of centuries of struggle and hope. The final note reverberated through the ballroom, lasting impossibly long, filled with controlled power that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers. The response was instantaneous. The audience erupted in a standing ovation that made the previous applause seem tepid in comparison. Distinguished socialites who normally offered only polite golf claps were on their feet, cheering openly. A renowned Broadway director in attendance wiped tears from his eyes. Charles remained seated, now alone in his chair, as even his wife Patricia had risen to applaud. His face cycled through various emotions, anger, embarrassment, confusion, before settling into a mask of forced neutrality. The isolation of his position was stark and obvious to everyone in the room. Lisa pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face, and rushed onto the stage. She threw her arms around Vanessa, not caring about decorum or proper behavior. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "You actually did it." Vanessa hugged her friend back, her own tears finally breaking free. The emotion she'd held in check during her performance and confrontation poured out. Years of suppressed feelings, memories of her mother, the weight of countless indignities, and now, finally, triumph. Around them, the atmosphere in the ballroom had transformed completely. Groups of guests were discussing the performance with animated gestures and excited voices. Several prominent musicians in attendance were already exchanging business cards and making calls. Extraordinary. Have you ever heard anything like it? Someone get her an agent immediately. The control in that last note. The event photographer, who had spent most of the evening taking carefully posed shots of wealthy donors, was now rapidly capturing this unexpected moment. The standing ovation, the emotional embrace on stage, and notably, Charles Whitman's isolated figure. Patricia Whitman, in a move that spoke volumes, walked away from her husband's table and approached the stage. Her Cartier bracelet caught the light as she reached for Vanessa's hand. "My dear," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I believe we've all been blind. Please accept my personal apology." The gesture wasn't lost on anyone. Patricia Whitman, known for her careful maintenance of social hierarchies, had just publicly aligned herself with the help. Charles's face turned an even deeper shade of red. A small group of musicians who had performed earlier in the evening gathered near the piano, gesturing excitedly to Vanessa. Their respect was obvious. They weren't looking at a housekeeper anymore, but at a fellow artist. Vanessa stood at the center of it all, transformed. Her simple dress now seemed elegant rather than cheap, her posture regal rather than submissive. She had stepped into her power, and the change was undeniable. The evening's carefully planned schedule had been completely disrupted. No one was checking their watches or making subtle exits. Instead, the crowd pressed closer to the stage, everyone wanting to be part of this unexpected moment. Lisa squeezed Vanessa's hand. "Your mom would be so proud," she whispered. Vanessa nodded, unable to speak for a moment. She could almost feel her mother's presence, could hear her voice saying, "Stand tall, mi amor. Your time has come." The night was far from over, and the repercussions of this moment would continue to unfold. But something fundamental had shifted in the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Old barriers had crumbled, pretenses had been stripped away, and raw talent had triumphed over social prejudice. Charles Whitman remained in his seat, watching as his carefully constructed world of social hierarchies and class distinctions began to unravel. The real question now was not whether things would change, but how far-reaching those changes would be. The crowd around Vanessa grew denser as guests jostled politely for a chance to speak with her. Gone was the invisible barrier that typically separated household staff from the elite. In its place, a swarm of business cards, handshakes, and enthusiastic praise. "You must come perform at my charity gala next month," insisted a silver-haired woman who chaired 3 major arts foundations. "We'll make it worth your while, of course." That final note, "That's a gift that can't be taught," declared a prominent vocal coach, pressing his card into her hand. "Call my office. We should discuss your future." Charles Whitman watched from his increasingly isolated position as his guests, people who had spent years cultivating his favor, gravitated away from him. His attempts to catch anyone's eye were met with turned backs or coolly polite nods. The social currency he'd traded in for decades was rapidly devaluing. Vanessa, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden attention, caught Lisa's eye and made a subtle gesture. Understanding immediately, Lisa helped create a path through the crowd, guiding Vanessa toward a quiet balcony off the main ballroom. The cool night air provided welcome relief from the intense atmosphere inside. New York's cityscape sparkled before them, a tapestry of lights and possibilities. Vanessa leaned against the stone railing, taking deep breaths. "I can't believe I just did that," she whispered more to herself than to Lisa. "Well, I can," Lisa replied firmly. "You've got at least 15 business cards in your hand right now. Do you know how many of those people would have walked past you an hour ago without a second glance?" Before Vanessa could respond, the balcony door opened. Charles Whitman stood there, his usual confidence notably absent. He had loosened his bow tie, and a slight sheen of sweat was visible on his forehead. "Miss Martinez," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I believe we should discuss Dash." Lisa stepped forward, positioning herself between Vanessa and Charles. "I don't think this is the appropriate time, Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice firm. "Miss Martinez has other people she needs to speak with." The use of Miss Martinez, a formality he'd never extended to Vanessa, wasn't lost on Charles. His jaw tightened and used to be, being dismissed by his own assistant. I'm still her employer, he started, but Lisa cut him off. For now, she said quietly, but with steel in her voice. But after tonight, I suspect that's going to change. And I think we both know why. Charles stood there for a moment, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Finally, he turned and walked back into the ballroom, his shoulders slightly hunched, a posture none of his employees had ever seen before. You didn't have to do that, Vanessa said to Lisa, though gratitude was clear in her voice. Yes, I did, Lisa replied. Tonight isn't about him anymore. It's about you and what comes next. Through the glass doors, they could see the continuing commotion in the ballroom. Groups of guests were still discussing the performance, some miming the dramatic high note, others engaged in intense conversations while glancing in Vanessa's direction. Patricia Whitman was holding court near the stage, and snippets of her conversation drifted out. Always knew there was something special about her. Though the words were supportive, they carried a hint of revisionist history that made both Vanessa and Lisa exchange knowing looks. The night had shifted into something neither of them could have predicted. The power dynamics that had seemed so permanent just hours ago had been fundamentally altered. But with change came uncertainty, and Vanessa knew that the coming days would bring both opportunities and challenges. As they stood on the balcony, watching the city lights twinkle like stars, the weight of the evening's events began to settle. This wasn't just about one performance or one moment of standing up to power. It was about what would happen next, about the doors that had suddenly opened, and about the courage it would take to walk through them. The balcony door opened again, but this time it wasn't Charles. A group of musicians who had performed earlier approached, respect evident in their manner. Miss Martinez, one of them said, "We'd be honored if you join us for the final number of the evening." Vanessa looked at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. The night wasn't over yet, and there were still more surprises to come. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had evolved into something entirely different from the typical stuffy charity gala. A group of professional musicians had gathered near the grand piano, creating an impromptu ensemble. Among them was David Chun, a celebrated cellist with the New York Philharmonic, and Maria Torres, a rising opera star. Something contemporary, perhaps? Maria suggested, her eyes sparkling with excitement. We could blend classical with modern, show them what real fusion sounds like. Vanessa found herself drawn into their artistic discussion, her natural musical knowledge emerging as they debated arrangements and harmonies. The other musicians treated her as a peer, not as someone who had been serving drinks just hours earlier. Meanwhile, Charles Whitman stood near the bar, attempting to salvage what remained of his reputation. He clinked a spoon against his glass, trying to gather attention for an impromptu speech. Where earlier such a gesture would have brought immediate silence, now only a few guests turned his way. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness, "I want to address what we've witnessed tonight." He paused, adjusting his tie nervously. "It seems I've been, perhaps, too hasty in my judgments. We must all learn to recognize talent in unexpected places." The response was tepid. Several guests exchanged skeptical glances, seeing through the transparent attempt at damage control. Patricia Whitman watched her husband with a mixture of embarrassment and resignation, touching her pearl necklace in a nervous gesture. Back at the piano, Vanessa had taken her position among the musicians. They had chosen Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, but with a unique arrangement that showcased each performer's strength. In GDHS, the cellist began with a haunting introduction, and when Vanessa's voice joined in, the combination created something entirely new. This performance was different from her first, where before she had sung with the power of suppressed pain. Now she sang with the freedom of someone who had broken through their chains. The other musicians responded to her energy, building a performance that had even the most jaded socialites swaying. Throughout the song, Charles made several attempts to approach various influential guests, but each time he found himself subtly blocked or politely dismissed. The social machinery he had operated so skillfully for decades had turned against him. "Extraordinary talent," remarked Jonathan Foster, a prominent Broadway producer, deliberately turning his back on Charles to address another guest. "To think she's been hidden away as household staff rather makes you wonder about the judgment of certain people, doesn't it?" The performance concluded to another standing ovation. David Chen immediately engaged Vanessa in conversation, his gestures animated as he discussed potential collaborations. Maria Torres was already on her phone, presumably calling her agent. "We're doing a series of charity concerts next month," David explained. "We'd love to have you join us. Paid, of course, and with proper billing." A representative from Lincoln Center had materialized beside them, business card in hand. "We should discuss our emerging artists program," she said. "Your voice would be perfect for our contemporary classical series." Charles made one final attempt to insert himself into the conversation, raising his voice to be heard. "As Vanessa's employer, I fully support Dash, former employer," Lisa interrupted smoothly, appearing at Vanessa's side. "I believe Miss Martinez's schedule will be quite full with her musical commitments." The statement hung in the air like a declaration of independence. Charles opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, finally reading the room correctly. He retreated to a corner, his social defeat complete. As the night progressed, Vanessa found herself in discussions about recording sessions, concert dates, and potential representations. The same people who had looked through her hours earlier now hung on her every word. But amid the excitement, she caught glimpses of Charles watching from the periphery, his expression unreadable. Something in his demeanor suggested that this story wasn't quite over, that there were still revelations to come. The night was winding down, but tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. The question wasn't just about what Vanessa would do with her newly recognized talent, but how the revelations of this evening would reshape everyone's lives. As the evening began to wind down, Charles Whitman sat alone at his table, absently swirling the ice in his untouched scotch. The man who had started the evening as the center of attention now watched from the sidelines as his former housekeeper became the star of his own gala. Through the crowd, he observed how naturally Vanessa handled her newfound attention. She displayed none of the desperate social climbing he'd expected, instead carrying herself with genuine grace and humility. Each interaction forced him to confront his own prejudices, like looking into a mirror he'd been avoiding for years. "Mr. Whitman?" A server approached cautiously with a phone. "Your son Alexander is on the line from London. He says it's urgent." Charles took the phone, his face darkening as he listened. After a brief conversation, he set the phone down with trembling hands. Whatever he'd heard had clearly shaken him. Meanwhile, Vanessa found herself in conversation with Sarah Reynolds, one of New York's most respected music producers. They sat in a quiet corner, away from the dwindling crowd. "I have a studio slot open next week," Sarah said, pulling out her tablet to check her calendar. "Just a demo recording, nothing binding. But I think we could capture something special." Vanessa's heart raced at the opportunity. "I would need to give notice of my current position," she began, but Lisa, ever present and supportive, cut in. "I think after tonight, that's already taken care of," Lisa said firmly. Then, lowering her voice, "Besides, I've already packed up your things from the staff quarters. They're in my car." The gesture brought tears to Vanessa's eyes. Lisa had believed in this outcome so completely that she'd prepared for it in advance. Across the room, Charles struggled to his feet, his usual poise noticeably absent. He made his way toward the exit, but Patricia intercepted him. "Charles, you can't just leave," she hissed. "The press is still here. Think about what this will look like." "It doesn't matter anymore," he muttered, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of defeat. The phone call had clearly delivered news that changed everything. The remaining guests watched this exchange with poorly concealed interest. Charles Whitman showing weakness was like seeing a crack in a fortress wall. Fascinating and somewhat alarming. Sarah Reynolds continued outlining plans with Vanessa, unaware of the drama unfolding across the room. "We'll start with something simple, really let your voice shine. I'm thinking a blend of classical and contemporary pieces. I have some original compositions," Vanessa admitted quietly. "Things I wrote during breaks at work or late at night when the house was quiet." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Even better. Authenticity is what we're after. Your story, your voice." Lisa watched this exchange with satisfaction, but her attention was divided. She hadn't missed Charles's reaction to the phone call, nor the way Patricia was now hurriedly consulting with their family lawyer in a corner. Something was happening behind the scenes, something beyond tonight's musical revelation. Lisa had worked for the Whitmans long enough to recognize the signs of a brewing storm. Charles made another attempt to leave, but now Jonathan Foster, the Broadway producer, stood in his path. Leaving so soon, Charles? Just when things are getting interesting. His tone was light, but his eyes were sharp. I was hoping to discuss your foundation's arts funding, particularly given tonight's discoveries. Charles straightened his spine, summoning what remained of his dignity. Another time, Jonathan. Family emergency. Of course, Jonathan replied smoothly, though I can't help but wonder about the timing. The exchange didn't go unnoticed by others in the room. Whispers started circulating, speculation building about what could have rattled the unflappable Charles Whitman. Vanessa, still deep in conversation with Sarah Reynolds, remained unaware of these undercurrents. Her focus was on the future suddenly opening before her, on the possibilities she'd denied herself for so long. But Lisa, ever observant, watched Charles's retreat with growing suspicion. In her years working for the Whitmans, she'd learned that nothing was ever quite as simple as it seemed. Tonight's events had set something in motion, something bigger than a talented housekeeper finding her voice. The night was nearly over, but the story was far from finished. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, and the true impact of this evening's events was yet to be understood. The following morning, Vanessa woke up on Lisa's couch to find her phone flooded with messages. Videos of her performance had gone viral overnight, shared by gala attendees with influential social media followings. But it was an email from Patricia Whitman that caught her attention. Please come to the house at your earliest convenience. There are matters we need to discuss. Charles insists. Lisa read the email over Vanessa's shoulder, her expression concerned. You don't have to go. You don't owe them anything. But Vanessa felt a pull she couldn't explain. Something's different. Did you see Charles's face after that phone call? They arrived at the Whitman mansion an hour later. The house felt different now, less intimidating, its grandeur somehow diminished. Patricia led them to Charles's study, a room Vanessa had only entered to clean. Charles sat behind his massive desk, looking older than he had the night before. The morning newspapers were spread before him, several featuring photos of Vanessa's performance. Sit please, he said, his voice lacking its usual command. What I'm about to share, it requires context. He pulled out an old photograph from his desk drawer. It showed a younger Charles standing next to a black woman in front of a small jazz club. This was my mother, he said quietly. My biological mother, Eleanor Williams. She was a jazz singer in the 60s. The revelation hung in the air like suspended dust. Patricia touched her husband's shoulder, encouraging him to continue. I was adopted by the Whitmans when I was 3. They gave me their name, their privilege, their prejudices. His voice cracked slightly. My son Alexander discovered this while researching our family history. That's what his call was about last night. Vanessa sat perfectly still, processing this information. Lisa's hand found hers, squeezing gently. The irony, Charles continued, is that the Whitman Foundation was originally established to support artists from underprivileged backgrounds. My adoptive parents twisted its purpose over time, made it about maintaining social hierarchies instead. He stood up, walking to the window. When you sang last night, you reminded me of her. I've spent decades running from my own history, becoming exactly what my adoptive parents wanted. And in doing so, I became everything my birth mother fought against. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken emotions. Patricia spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. We've spent the morning discussing changes to the Foundation's mission, returning it to its original purpose. Charles turned back to face Vanessa. I can't undo what I've done, the person I've been, but I can try to make it right. We'd like you to join the Foundation's board. Help us identify and support talented artists who need opportunities. The offer was unexpected, complex in its implications. Vanessa felt the weight of responsibility, of potential change. I won't give up my singing, she said firmly. We wouldn't want you to, Patricia replied. Your voice, your story, they're exactly what the Foundation needs. Charles picked up the photograph again, studying it. My mother died, never knowing what happened to her son. I became everything she would have despised, judgmental, elitist, cruel. "It's never too late to change," Vanessa said quietly, surprising herself with the words. Lisa watched the exchange with cautious optimism. The power dynamic had shifted again, but this time towards something more complex than simple reversal. "The foundation has considerable resources," Charles continued. "Resources that could help launch careers, create opportunities, break down barriers. With your guidance." Vanessa stood up, walking to where Charles stood. She looked at the photograph of Eleanor Williams, seeing the same determination in the woman's eyes that she'd seen in her own mother's. "I'll need to see the foundation's current structure, its funding allocation, its decision-making processes," she said, her business degree finally finding its purpose. "And complete autonomy in artistic decisions." Charles nodded, relief visible on his face. "Of course, whatever you need." The morning sun streamed through the study windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. In that moment, the past and future seemed to converge, offering a path forward that none of them could have imagined 24 hours ago. But as Vanessa would soon discover, this was just the beginning of an even more extraordinary story. The next day's New York Times headline read, "Whitman Foundation Revelation: A Legacy of Jazz and Hidden Heritage." The article detailed not only Vanessa's breakthrough performance, but also the remarkable discovery of Charles Whitman's true parentage and the Foundation's original mission. In Charles's study, surrounded by decades of Foundation documents, Vanessa discovered something extraordinary. Eleanor Williams, Charles's biological mother, hadn't just been any jazz singer. She'd been the recipient of one of the first Whitman Foundation grants in 1965, before the Whitmans adopted Charles. She was pregnant when she received the grant, Charles explained, his voice thick with emotion as he read through old papers. She planned to use the money to record an album and provide for a child. But then, the Whitmans intervened, Patricia finished quietly. They saw an opportunity to both silence a potential scandal and gain an heir. The full story emerged through yellowed documents and old correspondence. The Whitmans had used their influence to pressure Eleanor into giving up her child, promising both continued Foundation support for other artists and a better life for her son. Instead, they'd systematically dismantled the Foundation's original mission after gaining custody of Charles. "They raised me to be ashamed of where I came from," Charles said, staring at his mother's photograph. "To reject everything she represented." Vanessa sat at what had once been Charles's desk, now temporarily serving as her workspace, while she reviewed the Foundation's records. "The question is," she said, "what do we do with this information?" The answer came in the form of a complete restructuring of the Whitman Foundation. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa worked with a team of lawyers and financial advisors to craft a new mission statement and operational structure. The Foundation would now focus on two main initiatives: supporting underprivileged artists through grants and educational programs, and preserving the legacy of forgotten artists like Eleanor Williams. Charles insisted on naming the main grant program the Eleanor Williams Fellowship. As part of the restructuring, Vanessa's role evolved beyond board member to become the Foundation's new creative director. Her first major project would combine both her artistic talents and her business acumen: a benefit concert featuring both established artists and Foundation recipients, past and present. "We're not just changing the Foundation," she explained to a group of reporters at the official announcement. "We're acknowledging its true history and building something new from that truth." The story caught fire in the media. The wealthy businessman discovering his jazz singer mother's identity, the talented housekeeper who sparked the revelation, the Foundation's return to its original mission. It was a narrative that captured public imagination and sparked discussions about privilege, opportunity, and redemption. Charles, for his part, underwent a visible transformation. He spent hours in jazz clubs, listening to music his mother might have performed. He spoke openly about his journey from adopted privilege to understanding his true heritage. The man who had once weaponized exclusivity now became an advocate for inclusion. 1 month after the gala, Vanessa stood on the stage of Lincoln Center, preparing for her first major performance as both an artist and the Foundation's creative director. In the audience sat Charles and Patricia Whitman, along with Lisa and a host of music industry professionals. But the most powerful moment came during the intermission, when Charles unveiled a previously unknown recording of Eleanor Williams, discovered in the Foundation's archives. Her voice, strong and clear, filled the concert hall, a bridge across decades of silence. As Vanessa returned to the stage for the second half, she carried with her not just her own story, but the weight of Eleanor's legacy and the promise of change. Her voice joined with a new generation of Foundation recipients, creating a harmony that spoke of both past and future. The evening ended with an unprecedented collaboration. Vanessa performing a duet with Eleanor's recorded voice, their voices intertwining across time, singing about dreams deferred and finally realized. In the aftermath, Charles approached Vanessa backstage. "My mother would have been proud," he said simply. "Not just of me finally finding my way back to who I am, but of you for helping make it happen." Vanessa smiled, understanding that their story had become something larger than either of them had imagined, a testament to the power of talent to break barriers, of truth to heal wounds, and of music to bridge the gaps between past and present, privilege and opportunity, loss and redemption. The Whitman Foundation had come full circle, and in doing so, had opened a new chapter in its history, one that would continue to resonate through the lives it touched and the artists it empowered for generations to come.